October 29th, 1964, Santa Monica Civic Auditorium. The air backstage was thick with cigarette smoke, hairspray, and the electric tension that only comes before a show of this magnitude. The T.A.M.I. show, Teenage Awards Music International, was unlike anything anyone had attempted before. British invasion meets American soul, rock meets rhythm and blues, all captured on film for posterity. The hallways buzzed with the controlled chaos of rock and roll history in the making. In the cramped dressing room that smelled of old wood and nervous sweat, Marvin Gaye sat hunched over a small mirror, adjusting his tie for the third time in 10 minutes. His hands trembled slightly as he smoothed down his hair. Through the thin walls, he could hear the muffled roar of the audience and the distant thump of drums from the stage. Someone was performing Surfin' USA, the Beach Boys. They sounded confident, effortless, everything Marvin wished he felt. At 25, Marvin had been recording for Motown for just 2 years. He'd had some success, sure. Pride and Joy had done well. Can I Get a Witness was climbing the charts. But standing here, surrounded by legends, he felt like an imposter. Chuck Berry was somewhere in this maze of dressing rooms, the man who had practically invented rock and roll, whose guitar riffs had influenced everyone from the Beatles to the Stones. The Rolling Stones themselves were tuning up in the room next door, their British accents carrying through the thin walls as they argued about tempo changes. They were the new darlings of the music press, the bad boys who were supposedly more dangerous than the Beatles. Earlier, he'd watched the Supremes glide past his door like 3 graceful swans, their sequined dresses catching the harsh hallway light. Diana Ross had nodded at him politely, but Marvin could see the focus in her eyes, the way she was already mentally preparing for their performance. They belonged here in a way that made Marvin question his own presence. And then there was James Brown. James Brown, who had been doing this for over a decade. James Brown, whose performance at the Apollo had become the stuff of legend. James Brown, who could make an audience lose their minds with nothing but a scream and a split. Marvin had never seen anything like the energy that man brought to a stage. It was raw, primal, almost violent in its intensity. And here Marvin was, the quiet kid from Detroit, about to share the same stage. A knock on the door interrupted his spiral of self-doubt. 5 minutes, Mr. Gaye. Marvin nodded, though the stagehand had already moved on. He stood up, checked his reflection one more time, and stepped into the narrow hallway that connected the dressing rooms. The corridor buzzed with activity, roadies carrying equipment, backing singers warming up their voices, managers barking instructions into phones. In the middle of it all, like the eye of a hurricane, stood James Brown. He was smaller than Marvin had expected, maybe 5'6" in his platform shoes, but there was something about his presence that made him seem to fill the entire hallway. He wore a sharp black suit, his hair processed and gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. His band members clustered around him like disciples, hanging on his every word as he gave them final instructions for their set. Remember, when I drop down, you keep playing, James was saying, his voice carrying the authority of a general briefing his troops. Don't stop, no matter what. The music stops, the magic stops. You understand? The musicians nodded in unison. James turned, and his eyes met Marvin's across the hallway. For a moment, neither man moved. Then James broke into a wide grin and walked over. Well, well, if it isn't Marvin Gaye. James extended his hand. His grip was firm, calloused from years of grabbing microphone stands and spinning across stages. Heard good things about you, young blood. Real good things. Marvin felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. Mr. Brown, it's an honor, sir. Sir? James laughed, a rich sound that seemed to come from deep in his chest. Man, we're about to share the same stage. Call me James. He looked Marvin up and down, taking in the nervous energy that Marvin was trying so hard to hide. First time at something like this? Marvin nodded. I mean, I've done shows before, but nothing like this. He gestured vaguely at the organized chaos surrounding them. I get it. James's voice dropped lower, more intimate. You know what I was doing before my first big show? Throwing up in an alley behind the theater? True story. Couldn't keep anything down for 3 hours. Marvin stared at him. Really? Scout's honor. Though I was never actually a scout, James chuckled. Point is, nerves ain't nothing but energy looking for a place to go. You just got to figure out how to point that energy in the right direction. Before Marvin could respond, a stagehand appeared next to them. Mr. Brown, you're up in two. James nodded, then turned back to Marvin. You watch me out there, you hear? Not to copy what I do, but to see how I use what I got. Every performer's different. You got something special, I can tell. You just got to trust it. With that, James Brown disappeared into the crowd of people heading toward the stage. Marvin stood there for a moment, processing what had just happened. The man who was widely considered the hardest working performer in show business had just taken time to calm his nerves. It didn't make sense with everything Marvin had heard about James Brown's reputation, his intensity, his demanding perfectionism. Curiosity got the better of him. Instead of returning to his dressing room, Marvin followed the crowd toward the stage. He found a spot in the wings where he could see without being in the way. The previous act was finishing up, and the stage hands were making final adjustments to the lighting rig. Then the announcer's voice boomed over the sound system. Ladies and gentlemen, the hardest working man in show business, Mr. Dynamite, James Brown. The crowd erupted. Not the polite applause that had greeted the earlier acts, but something closer to a roar. James burst onto the stage like he'd been shot out of a cannon, and immediately Marvin understood why people talked about him the way they did. This wasn't just a performance. It was something primal, something that spoke to a part of the human experience that had nothing to do with melody or lyrics and everything to do with pure, unleashed energy. James grabbed the microphone and launched into Out of Sight, his latest single. But it wasn't the studio version. It was bigger, wilder, more alive than anything Marvin had ever heard. James moved across the stage like he was possessed, spinning, dropping to his knees, leaping back up without missing a beat. His band followed him like they were reading his mind, matching his every move with musical punctuation that turned the song into something approaching religious experience. The cameras, massive 35mm film cameras positioned at strategic points around the stage, captured every moment, their operators trying to keep up with James's frenetic movement. This wasn't just a concert, it was a filmed document of something unprecedented. The audience, mostly teenagers who had won contests or bought tickets with their allowance money, screamed with a ferocity that seemed to shake the building's foundations. Girls in the front row were crying, reaching toward the stage with desperate fingers, as if touching James might somehow change their lives. Marvin noticed how the sound bounced differently in this venue than in the smaller clubs where he usually performed. Every scream, every drum beat, every guitar riff seemed to multiply and echo back, creating a wall of sound that was almost physical in its intensity. The lighting rig, more sophisticated than anything he'd seen before, painted James in dramatic shadows and brilliant white spots that made him seem larger than life, mythical. But what struck Marvin most wasn't the theatrics or the production values. It was the way James connected with the audience. He wasn't performing for them, he was performing with them. When he screamed, they screamed back. When he fell to his knees, they leaned forward as if pulled by invisible strings. It was like watching someone conduct an orchestra of 3,000 people, each one playing their part in perfect synchronization. Please, 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 James sang, and the crowd sang it back to him. Not the words exactly, but the feeling behind them, the desperation, the longing, the pure human need for connection. Marvin had never seen anything like it. 20 minutes later, James Brown stumbled off the stage, drenched in sweat, his hair disheveled, his perfect suit wrinkled and stained. But he was grinning like a man who just discovered fire. His band members crowded around him, offering towels and water, but James waved them off. His eyes scanned the crowd until they found Marvin. "What did you think?" James asked, still breathing hard. Marvin realized his mouth had been hanging open. He closed it, tried to find words. I've never seen anything like that. That's because ain't nothing like that." James accepted a towel from one of his musicians and wiped his face. "That's what happens when you stop trying to be perfect and start trying to be real." "But how do you know what they want?" "Know what?" James looked at him with something that might have been sympathy. "You got it backwards, young blood. It ain't about giving them what they want. It's about showing them what they need, what they're hungry for, even if they don't know it yet. James paused, studying Marvin's face. You know what your biggest asset is? You think it's that smooth voice, don't you? That technique you learned in all those gospel choirs? Marvin nodded hesitantly. Nah, it's that you feel everything deep. I can see it in your eyes, the way you carry yourself. Most singers, they perform emotions. You live them. That's rare, man. That's precious. But you got to learn to trust it, not hide from it. James leaned against the concrete wall of the backstage corridor. Around them, stagehands continued their choreographed dance of equipment changes and last-minute adjustments. The distant sound of the Beach Boys finishing their set filtered through the maze of hallways. Let me tell you something about this business, James continued, his voice dropping to a more intimate register. Everybody's going to try to tell you who you should be. The record companies, the radio programmers, even your own fans once you get them. They'll want to put you in a box, make you predictable. You resist that with everything you got, you hear me? The moment you become what they expect, you stop being an artist and become a product. A stagehand appeared next to them again. Mr. Gaye, you're on in 10. Marvin felt his stomach drop. The confidence he'd felt while watching James perform evaporated instantly. I don't know if I can follow that. You don't follow it, James said firmly. You do something completely different. You think I could do what you do? Sing like you sing? Man, I wish I had half your voice. But I don't. So I do what I can do, and I do it better than anybody else. He placed a hand on Marvin's shoulder. It was warm, steady. You know what your problem is? You're trying to be somebody else's version of great instead of your own version. Stop that. Be Marvin Gaye. The world's got enough James Browns. It needs the first Marvin Gaye. With that, James Brown walked away, his entourage trailing behind him like the tail of a comet. Marvin stood there, processing what had just happened. In the space of an hour, his entire understanding of performance, of artistry, of what it meant to be on a stage, had been turned upside down. When his name was called, Marvin walked onto the same stage where James Brown had just created magic. The crowd was still buzzing from the previous performance, their energy high but unfocused. They were expecting another James Brown. Instead, they got something completely different. The lights dimmed slightly as Marvin approached the microphone. He could feel the heat from the film cameras, see their large lenses trained on him like mechanical eyes. The audience, 3,000 strong, fell into an expectant hush. He could see individual faces in the front rows. Young women with bouffant hairdos and heavy eyeliner, young men in narrow ties and slicked-back hair, all of them waiting to see what this relatively unknown Motown singer would do after James Brown's explosive performance. Marvin didn't spin or scream or drop to his knees. He stood at the microphone, closed his eyes for just a moment to center himself, and sang. Not the studied, controlled performance he'd been planning, but something deeper, something true. Pride and joy became a conversation between Marvin and the audience, intimate and personal despite the massive venue. His voice, pure and vulnerable, cut through the space like a blade, finding its way into hearts rather than demanding attention from bodies. When he sang, "Can I get a witness?" it wasn't a demand but a question, vulnerable and honest. The audience leaned forward unconsciously, drawn into his quiet intensity. The audience responded, but differently than they had to James. Where James had made them wild, Marvin made them quiet. Where James had made them move, Marvin made them feel. By the time he finished his set, the Santa Monica Civic Auditorium had become something like a church. 3,000 people united in a moment of shared emotion. As Marvin walked off the stage, he found James Brown waiting for him in the wings. The older man was nodding, a satisfied smile on his face. Now that, James said, was something special. I just did what you said. I tried to be myself. Nah, man, you did more than that. James's expression grew serious, his eyes reflecting the wisdom of someone who'd fought for every inch of respect he'd earned. You trusted yourself. That's different. That's harder. Most people spend their whole lives running from who they really are, trying to be someone else's version of perfect. You just showed them your heart unfiltered. That takes guts. He paused, watching as stagehands began setting up for the Rolling Stones' closing set. Remember this feeling, young blood, this moment right here, when you know you did something real. Hold on to it when the business tries to change you, because it will try. They stood there for a moment, two very different artists who had just shared something profound. Around them, the T.A.M.I. show continued. The Rolling Stones were getting ready to close out the evening, and there was talk that they were nervous about following James Brown. But Marvin barely noticed the chaos. For the first time in his career, he felt like he understood something fundamental about what he was supposed to be doing. "Mr. Brown," Marvin said. "Thank you." James nodded once, then disappeared back into the crowd. Years later, after Marvin had become a star in his own right, after he'd recorded What's Going On and changed the trajectory of popular music, he would look back on that night as a turning point. Not because James Brown had taught him how to perform, but because he taught him something more valuable: how to trust the thing that made him different. The T.A.M.I. show ended that night, but something else had begun. Two kings had met, each had recognized the other's royalty, and both had walked away richer for the encounter. In a world that often tried to make artists compete against each other, James Brown and Marvin Gaye had discovered something rarer: mutual respect, and the understanding that there was room enough on the mountaintop for both of them. The lesson would stay with Marvin for the rest of his life. When he started working with Tammy Terrell 3 years later, he wouldn't try to be James Brown. He would be Marvin Gaye, and that would be enough, more than enough. It would be everything.